Hey there, folks. Thanks for joining us for another installment of America Explained. And today we're going to be discussing the Declaration of Independence, because when Americans talk about freedom, they usually start here. There's a sentence in the second paragraph: all men are created equal. But when you look a little closer at how that sentence is used, it appears once right at the beginning and then quietly disappears. The Declaration of Independence never explained who counts as men. It never defines what equal means in practice, and it never returns to claim that again. And we should keep that in mind because this document, the Declaration of Independence, wasn't written to make equality real. It doesn't establish a government. It doesn't create enforceable rights. It doesn't tell you how power will be shared or limited. The Declaration of Independence wasn't a rule book. It's an argument written to justify rebellion, separation, and an act that, under the law of the time, was treason. So when the Declaration talks about equality, it isn't describing reality. It's setting a moral stake in the ground, not saying this is how America works, but saying this is why we're willing to tear everything apart. And everything that follows is the cost of making that claim without explaining how to live up to it. So why does this document exist? Well, you got to remember, in 1776, the colonies are not a nation. They have no constitution, no unified government, no army that can realistically stand up to the British Empire. What they do have is a war already underway. Shots have been fired, people are dead, and rebellion against the crown is punishable by execution. So this document has one overriding purpose: to explain to Britain, to Europe, and to history itself why rebellion is justified. This is why the Declaration doesn't sound like modern law. It sounds like a legal brief mixed up with a breakup letter. And it was meant to persuade a few different groups: foreign governments whose support the colonies desperately needed, colonialists who are still undecided, and the future generations who will judge whether this was reckless or necessary. Now, keep in mind the Declaration isn't random, and it's not some freestyled improvisation. It's carefully structured. It has 4 major parts. First, a philosophical introduction. This is where we get natural rights, equality, and consent of the governed. Second, a theory of legitimate rebellion. The claim that when a government becomes destructive to those rights, people have the authority to replace it. And third, a long list of grievances against King George III. Not vague complaints, specific accusations meant to prove a pattern of abuse. And then finally, the formal declaration itself, that the colonies are now free and independent states. This structure mirrors a legal indictment. Here is the standard. Here is how it was violated. Here is why separation is justified. The language of the Declaration draws heavily from Enlightenment philosophy, ideas associated with thinkers like John Locke, and maybe some ideas we should be thinking about now. These ideas are things like people are born with natural rights, and governments exist to protect those rights. This is pretty important too. Power comes from consent, and tyranny dissolves political obligation. But you gotta keep in mind, this language was radical for its time, but it's also deliberately abstract. The Declaration does not define citizenship. It does not explain voting. It does not describe equality in practice, because again, this isn't law. It's aspirational language designed to establish moral legitimacy, not policy. So what did the document actually accomplish? Well, it formally announced independence. It appeals to foreign powers for legitimacy and alliance and frames the revolution as lawful resistance rather than chaos. But with that being said, it does not end slavery or grant rights to women or protect indigenous nations, or create enforceable equality. Those questions are postponed, sometimes for generations. And this is where this tension becomes impossible to ignore. The same men declaring equality owned enslaved people, excluded women from political life entirely, and described indigenous people as merciless savages. And so this isn't a footnote. It's central to the document. Men is doing a lot of work here. And it does not mean humanity. It means a specific class of people. And this isn't hypocrisy by accident. It's selective application. The radical part of the Declaration isn't that it was honest. It's that it created a standard the country couldn't permanently escape. Once you say equality out loud, people will eventually ask, why don't you mean it? So if it's built on this contradiction, why does the Declaration still matter? Well, every major expansion of rights in American history point back to this document. The Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Suffrage Act, LGBTQ rights, all pointed back to this document. Again, not because the Declaration delivered those freedoms, but because it promised them without explaining how. It planted a moral claim that future generations could and did throw back in America's face. The Declaration of Independence is saying what it wants to believe about itself. Everything that follows, the Constitution, the amendments, the protests, the conflicts, is a fight over whether it actually meant it. And today we see that fight in how the nation debates the treatment of immigrants. The United States is sharply divided over immigration policy, not just on how many people should come, but how they're treated once here, on the violence of enforcement, on the detention and deportation practices, and on the ethical obligations of a country built on freedom. Immigrants are living in fear over aggressive actions by federal immigrant agents, including fatal shootings and detentions that have shaken up cities like Minneapolis and fueled national protests. Many immigrants themselves, including naturalized citizens and lawfully present residents, report rising fear of detention, deportation, and unequal treatment under the system. In other words, the debate isn't just about foreign policy or economics. It's a moral argument over whether a nation that once declared all men are equal can extend dignity and fairness to those arriving on its shores, especially when enforcement tactics, legal uncertainty, and political polarization make that question urgent and painful. And again, remember, the Declaration didn't create freedom. It created a standard, a moral wager. And once a standard is written down, it doesn't go away just because it's inconvenient. It waits, it resurfaces, it fuels protest and pushes people to ask, is this nation living up to its own words, the ones it wrote before it understood what they would demand? Because the Declaration didn't present equality as a legal guarantee. It presented it as a claim about human worth. And every generation must decide whether it's a promise worth honoring or just another line in the text.